Hi, this is Mr. McLean, and in this session, we're going to talk about free energy. We're going to be looking at section 8.2, and we really want to get into the equation and make sure that we can understand how the different variables will change as we undergo different chemical changes and chemical reactions. So, first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we have a good understanding of what free energy is. And G is going to be the variable that we're going to use to represent free energy. And when we use the delta, we're talking about a change in the free energy that's named after Gibbs, who worked these equations out initially. And when we talk about what free energy is, we'd say it's the energy to do work whenever you have things like uniform temperature and pressure, which is what's going to be present inside of a cell. So when we look at the equation, and here's the equation, and I can promise you there'll be a couple questions on the test, not necessarily solving problems, but being able to evaluate how these variables will change. Let's go through and make sure we understand what each of them stands for. So at the beginning of the equation, we see our delta G. And as stated before, delta G is the free energy. And when we look at any type of chemical reaction, what we're going to be looking for is whether this delta G is a positive value or if it's a negative value. That's going to be the most important thing for us to assess, because we know that things that are negative in terms of their change in free energy are spontaneous. Okay, so that means that we won't have to invest additional energy into it. And those spontaneous reactions are going to be able to do work. So if we look at something that was spontaneous graphically, this is kind of what we're going to see. Well, maybe not to go down to zero, but you kind of get the picture. Let's look at this again. We'll go. All right, something along those lines. So you're going to have a release of energy, and that energy is able to be used to do work. So looking at the formula, our delta G is made up of our total energy. Okay, our total energy, which is referred to as enthalpy. Now I know these two words right here, entropy and enthalpy, are very close in terms of how they sound, but they definitely have a different meaning. So if we take our total energy, otherwise known as our enthalpy, and from that we subtract the value of entropy multiplied by our temperature in Kelvin. And when we put those concepts together, we're going to end up with a delta G that's either going to be positive or negative. So if we start to look at different scenarios in which we could have a positive delta G, okay, one of the things that would give us a positive delta G is that this value right here ends up being a negative value. Okay, so entropy is disorder. So if we end up with more order, then this value right here ends up being a positive value, and our delta G becomes positive. Any reaction that takes our organism, or I should say our molecules, and takes it from greater order to lesser order, sort of like when we looked at the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide and water, that would give you an increase in entropy. Okay, so if you have an increase in entropy, ultimately that keeps this total value right here being negative, and therefore the delta G becomes negative. All right, so you just kind of got to work through it and think about how these different variables are going to ultimately give you a delta G that is either going to be positive or negative. So in other words, if we have something that reduces the total energy and this value becomes negative, sort of like how this has more energy here and less energy here, if you reduce the total energy, then your delta G would be negative. Okay, and the other thing is you could take a look at a combination of those two things. As long as the process when summed together, and obviously you look at each of these different variables, as long as it comes out as a negative value, you have something that's going to be spontaneous, and you have something that's going to be able to release work or release energy that can be harnessed to do work. Okay, that's the most important thing that we want to look at. If you come up with something that's going to be a positive value, then it's going to ultimately need an investment in order to make that happen. So one of the things that we've mentioned before is that free energy is kind of a measure of that instability. So in the earlier part of the chapter, I showed you something where we had a guy on a platform, looked like a diving platform. And if you look at this position right here, in regards to the water surface, he's at a very unstable position, okay? And in order for him to go from here down to a position where there's greater stability, where he's at the water level, we don't really have to invest a lot of energy. Now, there might be this initial sort of almost like when you look at a reaction where you have your activation energy, but the idea is taking him from a point of great instability to a position of greater stability is something that we would say would have a delta G that was negative. Okay, so that would fall into the category of being spontaneous. Make sure you understand that spontaneous does not mean fast. Spontaneous just means that it's energetically favorable. So we can go from this position to this position without having to invest energy. Another scenario that we could take a look at, we have some molecules right here that are concentrated. And we know that molecules naturally want to diffuse out and fill up the available space. So we have order, and each of these things wants to expand out and increase the disorder. So in that particular situation, we would actually be boosting the level of disorder, and therefore this would be something that's spontaneous. Here's another example over on this end here. We have a molecule that is definitely more complex, okay, and it looks to be glucose. And when we metabolize that and we break this down into carbon dioxide and water molecules, the idea is that we've taken something that was more ordered and we've progressed to something that's more disordered. So all of these examples are all going to be things that are negative delta G, okay? And we also notice that these all have something in common, and that is that they are catabolic. They're breaking things down, or at least the last one is very easy to see as being catabolic. Now, if we wanted to reverse any of these scenarios, okay, so if you think about cellular respiration and photosynthesis, how they're not opposite processes, but they have, opposite products and reactants. If you take and go through like a photosynthetic process, you know that you're going to have an investment of energy. You're going to have to put light into that situation. So if you're going to go from very disordered things to a more ordered structure, then that would have a positive delta G, okay? And that would be anabolic. So, and if we have our guy down here and he's in the water and we want to get him to a position of instability, well, to go up those steps, you have to invest energy. So the overall thing that we're taking a look at is what's happening with our energy. So one of the things that you need to be able to do is look at graphs. And in this particular graph, it's just graphing the progression of the reaction over time compared to the free energy. So in this case right here, my reactants and my products. And the big thing that we notice is my value is negative in this case because we have a release of energy, and that can be used to do some work for us. If we go and look at this one here, it's the opposite, and we notice that the energy is being invested in. So we got one of those deals. So this is going to be a positive delta G. This is not spontaneous. So if you want this to occur, you need to invest energy. So those are some really important things to look at. Now, a couple final points to keep in mind in regards to evaluating different systems. We said that whenever you have a closed system, eventually it can reach equilibrium. And the concept of reaching equilibrium in terms of energy changes means that you eventually get to the point where you're not going to do any work. Fortunately for us, cells are not going to reach equilibrium as long as we are alive. Open systems are constantly involved in a flow of materials. So you're going to have energy that's coming into a system, and you're going to have byproducts leaving the system. And you can't really point to any time in a living organism's life where it doesn't need energy to come into that system. So we have this constant flow of energy, and that's because of the disequilibrium that we find. And that really is, as point number 3 say, it's a defining feature of metabolism and a defining feature of life that we never really reach at. So I had a couple pictures in the book that look at this Waterwheel hydroelectric system, and I think it does a good job of showing you how in closed systems you can reach equilibrium. So in this first picture, we can see initially at point A, there is no equilibrium, and we have a higher water value compared to a lower one, and the flow of water is obviously going to go from high to low. And as that water moves, we spin the turbine, we generate an energy that can be used to do work, which in this case was light the bulb. But eventually, because this is a closed system and there's nothing coming in and nothing going out, our system reaches equilibrium. And equilibrium gives us no change in free energy and no work being done. So this would be a bad thing. That's a system that is not alive, obviously. If you take the scenario of an open system, you got energy coming in and you got energy going out. And as long as you have your resources flowing from in to out, you have the capacity to make these changes. You have a negative delta G, which means that you can do work. Probably the more accurate analogy for a living organism is that these steps are incremental. So we're not going to have a one step and done type of thing. So you can see that you have your input of energy and you have your output of energy. And as it goes through here and we step down through these different stages right here, we're going to notice that there is a release of free energy that allows us to do work. So each one of these incremental steps is going to give us the capacity to do biological work. All right. And that's something that we're going to examine many times over. So hopefully that helps clear up a little of the information about the reaction and the concept of free energy. Like I said, the biggest thing that you need to be able to do is evaluate whether or not your system is going to have a positive delta G, in other words, a positive change in free energy, or a negative delta G. If it's negative, it's spontaneous. It's energetically favorable, and it's going to release energy. If you have a positive value, it's not spontaneous. It's an anabolic reaction. It's going to require an investment of energy, and like I said, when we examine different forms of life and different biological processes, we're going to see both of these at work. So just make sure you can evaluate that and make sure that on a graph, you can identify how those different variables are changing. Okay, hopefully that helps. I'll put out another video for the rest of Chapter 8.